Well, I want to tell you, I had this great plan to give you all a really great Christmas present tonight, but the elders said that we didn't have enough money in the budget for that, which is a shame, because if we had an extra $3,000 laying around, I was going to give everyone here, every man, woman, and child, a coffee bean. No, not just any coffee bean. I was going to give you a Kopi Luwak bean. Kopi Luwak is the most expensive and the rarest coffee on the planet. It's found in only one place on Earth, in Indonesia, on the island of Sumatra, in a region known as Java. There are only 1,000 pounds of Kopi Luwak harvested each year. If I had been able to give you a Kopi Luwak bean, I would have invited you to smell it. It would be nice and chocolatey. If I'd been able to give you a Kopi Luwak bean, I would have asked you to taste it. It would be nutty and bold. Then I would tell you the story of Kopi Luwak coffee beans. Kopi is Indonesian for coffee, and Luwak is Indonesian for cat, specifically the palm civet, the nocturnal, fruit-eating cousin of the mongoose. Don't be fooled by the cute picture. The Luwaks are the coffee snobs of the animal kingdom. What I mean is, they roam the island of Sumatra in search of the most perfect, the most ripe cherries. And they would rather starve than eat an inferior coffee cherry, and so they look for only the best. When they find them, they eat them, and they eventually pass them. Local harvesters then scour through the rainforest of Sumatra in search of what gets passed. They then pick through it in search of undigested coffee beans, which they then wash dry in the sun and sell for $300 a pound. Now, there are some gifts that probably shouldn't be given. I would argue that probably ranks somewhere in the top 3, if you ask me. You can thank our elders for the fact that you didn't get the Kopi Luwak bean tonight. The thing is when it comes to gifts that maybe shouldn't be given, I cannot help but think about the story that we've gathered around tonight. I can't help but wonder what a young teenage girl named Mary felt when she heard from a messenger from God who told her about a gift from God. The opening chapter of Luke's gospel says this, that God sent the angel Gabriel to Nazareth, a town in Galilee, to a virgin pledged to be married to a man named Joseph, a descendant of David. The virgin's name was Mary. The angel went to her and said, "Greetings, you who are highly favored. The Lord is with you." Mary was greatly troubled at his words and wondered what kind of greeting this might be. But the angel said to her, "Do not be afraid, Mary. You have found favor with God. You will conceive and give birth to a son, and you are to call him Jesus. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. The Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over Jacob's descendants forever. His kingdom will never end." "How will this be?" Mary asked the angel, "since I am a virgin?" The angel answered, "The Holy Spirit will come on you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. So the Holy One to be born will be called the Son of God. Even Elizabeth, your relative, is going to have a child in her old age, and she who is said to be unable to conceive is in her 6th month. For no word from God will ever fail." "I'm the Lord's servant," Mary answered. "May your word to me be fulfilled." Then the angel left her. Okay, so this messenger, this angel, shows up and says, "I have a gift for the world. I'm going to send a long-awaited Messiah into the world to save it." So far, so good, right? But then he continues and says, "Oh yes, and Mary, I have a gift for you as well. You're going to be the mother of the Messiah. Like, I'm going to miraculously cause you to conceive, and you are going to give birth to the Son of God." Now, Mary asks the obvious question, like, how can this be since I'm a virgin? Which I think is a way of saying, is this like a white elephant thing? Because I'm not sure that I want this gift. The thing is, as a Jewish person in the first century, she would have been expecting God and looking for and longing for God to deliver on his promises. She would have been praying for him to send the Messiah into the world. The thing is, I'd be willing to bet that Mary neither expected or wanted God's Messiah to come into the world this way. I mean, just think for a minute. Just imagine being Mary. Imagine trying to explain this to your neighbors, right? I mean, like, no, seriously, God did this. It's a miracle, right? I can imagine that Mary's neighbors might have a better chance of believing that people would one day pay $300 for a pound of coffee that was sourced from a cat's litter box than to believe that this child in her womb is the Son of God. Which means this was probably not an easy thing to accept. It might mean good news for the world, but it would also likely mean some rumor and some innuendo and some scandal for Mary. I think we have to expect that she's got to be reluctant here. And yet, she says at the end of the words that we just read in Luke 1, I'm the Lord's servant. May your word to me be fulfilled. Because Mary said that, the world will never be the same. That's because, as the carols that we have just sung reminded us, Jesus was born in Bethlehem. He would later move to his father's hometown of Nazareth, where he would grow up, and he would eventually grow up to become a man who would do things like healing the sick and caring for the poor, giving sight to the blind, pointing us to God. Of course, he would end up being betrayed and condemned to die on a cross for the sin of the world, only to rise again for the renewal of all things. Now, that's how the story goes, and that's actually why we're here tonight, right? I mean, as amazing as it is that a virgin would conceive is a pretty miraculous thing, but I don't know about you, I'm not giving up my Tuesday night for that. But we've gathered around more than just this point in the story. We've gathered around what happens after this, and we'll come back to that in a moment, but I actually do want us to take just a brief moment to consider the magnitude of this moment. Because what happens after Mary says yes is a pretty pivotal moment in the history of this planet. You might even say that it's like the Empire Strikes Back moment of history. Now, you'll have to forgive me for like an old guy, nostalgic moment. But in the film Empire Strikes Back, there's this famous line that even if you were born in this millennia, you probably know it. Darth Vader says to Luke Skywalker, what? I am your father. Okay, you've heard this one before. Okay. That is the most pivotal moment in the Star Wars saga. Because that revelation actually changes all sorts of things. Well, I guess I should say it was the most pivotal moment until Disney decided to blow up the Star Wars saga like the Death Star. But anyway, it was the most pivotal moment back in the day because it actually changes everything. It changes both what happened next and what happened before this. It changes what happens next, namely that we begin to understand why in the next film, like Return of the Jedi, why actually Darth Vader ends up coming to the aid of Luke Skywalker. He ends up saving the galaxy, bringing balance to the Force. That pivotal moment changes what happens next. But it also changes what happened in the past, or at least our understanding of it. Now all sorts of things make sense. Right? Looking back in hindsight, I mean, certainly we have that cringy moment of thinking about Luke Skywalker kissing his sister. But beyond that, in the prequels, we have this moment we recognize, oh, now we understand why everyone is so bent on protecting Luke from his father and actually raising him differently than his father. Well, in an odd kind of way, I would suggest to you that Jesus coming into the world is a bit like that. It changes everything. It changes what happens next. Again, you know how the story goes. We just talked about it. Again, we will come back to it. It changes what happens next because we recognize that God isn't interested in blowing up the world or condemning the world, but actually in saving it and rescuing his creation. But not only does this moment change what happens next, it actually changes the past, or at least our understanding of it. Now all of a sudden, the signs and shadows, they make sense. Now all of those prophecies ring true. Now all the waiting feels like it might actually be worth it. I mean, even if things don't always go the way we expect them to or the way we want them to, suddenly it feels like there is no doubt that God keeps his promises. Something pivotal happens on the heels of Luke chapter 1. And the world will never be the same as a result. The thing is, I would suggest to you that that only happens because of something pivotal that happens in Mary's life. Namely, the fact that she says yes to this. Mary accepts God's gift, even with all the baggage that comes along with it. And because she does that, something miraculous happens. The question is why does he say yes? Well, we aren't really told exactly, and so there is some mystery there, but it would seem that somehow God has convinced Mary that this is true. And I would even suggest that there may be a few gifts that are in this passage that might actually contribute to that. I'd point to 3 specifically: the assurance of God's promises, evidence of God's power, and the hope of God's presence. Assurance of his promises, evidence of his power, and the hope of his presence. Now, it starts with the assurance of his promises. And this comes from God's messenger, the angel, who actually echoes words from another messenger of God, namely the prophet Isaiah, which we heard read earlier. He says, "Your son will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. The Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over Jacob's descendants forever. His kingdom will never end." That's taken straight from Isaiah 9. And Mary, as a Jewish person, would have been familiar with those words. She would have been looking for them to be fulfilled. She would have, I assumed, believed in them if she didn't also maybe have some doubts about them. And I say that because, while I told you earlier that Jews like Mary were looking for the fulfillment of God's promises, I should actually clarify that most Jews were looking for this. And I say most because some people had actually started to give up on the hope of this. Even worse, some people had started taking matters into their own hands. There were some who just decided, you know what, if you can't beat this occupying force, might as well join them and work the system. There were others who were trying to blow this thing up, trying to topple it by acts of terrorism. But the fact is, things were not going the way they were supposed to go in Israel. They hadn't for centuries, and it seemed like God didn't care. That's because God had been silent for centuries. God hadn't sent a prophet for 400 years. It was starting to feel a bit like God had forgotten about his people, that he had forgotten about his promises. And as such, I don't know how much hope Mary had. I don't know if she actually felt like she could trust God or not. What I do know is God gives assurance of his promises. God assures Mary that he always keeps his promises, even if at times he may deliver on those promises in unexpected and seemingly impossible ways. You know, like delivering a baby who will deliver on those promises. And Mary asked the same question that I'm sure we would ask if we were in her shoes, right? How can I, a virgin, have a baby? Well, that's when God shows up, not just with assurance of his promises, but evidence of his power. He says to Mary, hey, your cousin Elizabeth is 6 months pregnant, which is actually a really big deal because Elizabeth was too old to have a child. I mean, like she was way past her childbearing years. This defied explanation. It's actually miraculous, maybe a little lower on the scale of wonder that compared to Mary's, but it's something that shouldn't happen. And yet it did, by the power of the Most High. Which is why God's messenger says in verse 37 that no word from God will ever fail, or more literally, nothing will be impossible with God. Now, it's at this point in the story that Mary says yes to God. She accepts this gift, but there's actually one more way that God actually is at work in the story, and if we aren't careful, it's really easy to overlook it. In addition to both providing assurance of his promises and evidence of his power, God gives, most importantly, the hope of his presence. And you actually have to go all the way back to the start of the story to see this. The first thing that this messenger, this angel from God, says to Mary is in verse 28. He says, "Greetings, you who are highly favored. The Lord is with you." Now, the term highly favored there literally means you who have been shown grace. And as for the Lord is with you, it means exactly what it looks like it means. It means that God is here, not somewhere off, quiet and unaware, but actually here. He's with you and for you, not against you. He's actually here offering you grace right now. That, combined with the assurance of his promise, his evidence, his power, is enough to convince Mary to say yes. And because Mary says yes to God's gift, God's Spirit overshadows her. Mary conceives and eventually gives birth to a son who would grow up to follow God all the days of his life, and even until death. To be strung up on a cross for you and for me and for the world. To rise again, to deliver on all of God's promises, to ensure the renewal of all things, and to establish a kingdom that will never end. A kingdom that God actually invites you and me to be a part of. It's actually an incredibly miraculous, incredibly astounding gift. In fact, it's so astounding that I think it's hard for some people to accept. I can imagine that some of us here have had a hard year. I can imagine that some of us may have had a hard life, and as such, it may be hard to believe that this could actually be true. Like, it's hard to believe that God would be for us given what we've been through. At the same time, I can imagine that some of us may remember a time when we believed this in the past, but life got busy, or maybe we feel like we got burned by the church, or maybe we just realized, that was my parents' faith and not mine, and we just kind of drifted away. I can imagine that some of us would like to believe this, but we just can't imagine how God could love someone like us, not after the things that we've done. I can imagine that some of us would like to believe this if we could just find a way to reconcile the miraculous parts of this story, with our disenchanted 21st post-Enlightenment intellectual worldview. There's no space for this in our heads. Again, I can imagine that some of us may be afraid to believe because we know that not only will our friends think we're crazy, but belief might actually require some change in our lives, and that's a scary thing. And of course, I know that some of us believe the good news, but we're here tonight because we need to be reminded of just how good the good news is. We need to be reminded of just how good God is. What I'm saying is I assume that there is a full spectrum of faith in the room, because I always think there's a full spectrum of faith in every room, even a room like this, at a church on Christmas Eve. The good news is it isn't just a spectrum of faith in the room. I believe that God is in the room. Because God, who came into our world in this child, lived and died and lives again. And because he does, he truly is Emmanuel, God with us. Which I take to mean literally, that he is with us tonight. He's here not to condemn us, not to pile on, but to offer us grace. To offer us the assurance of his promises and the evidence of his power and the hope of his presence. That he's actually here saying this: greetings, you who are highly favored. You who have been shown grace. I, the Lord, am with you. Can you hear his voice? He's speaking. And I think he's offering everyone here, every man, woman, and child, a gift. Merry Christmas.